In December 1098, on the limestone plains of Syria, the army of God became an army of monsters, and our silver-armored good knight stood witness as 20,000 souls were slaughtered in the sack of Maarat al-Numan. But the massacre was only the beginning of the horror. As the Crusader princes quarreled over stones and sovereignty, while their soldiers starved in the ruins, the First Crusade descended into its darkest hour. A month-long famine so severe that the Christian army began to eat the dead, roasting the flesh of their Muslim victims over campfires in scenes that would haunt Islamic memory for 1,000 years. This wasn't a tale whispered in secret. The Crusader leaders themselves confessed it in writing to the Pope, admitting that the putrid bodies of the Saracens were eaten up by the Christian people, a sin so profound it threatened to delegitimize the entire armed pilgrimage before it could reach Jerusalem. Watch as the chivalric ideal collapses under the weight of biological necessity, as knights who swore oaths to Christ find themselves gnawing on human bones, and as our immortal good knight survives the siege that broke the soul of the crusade itself. From the betrayal that turned a promised truce into a bloodbath, to the cannibalism that transformed the Franks into monsters in Muslim eyes, to the soldiers' revolt that tore down the very walls they had died to capture, every moment of this nightmare shaped the brutal reality of holy war. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive historical journeys that take you into the darkest corners of the past, where our eternal knight in silver armor walks through history's most harrowing moments with storytelling designed for deep focus, reflection, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which moment in Crusader history you'd like the good knight to witness next. But for now, settle in and journey back to that frozen December of 1098, when the army of pilgrims became an army of cannibals. The good knight had learned to measure time not by the sun, but by the gnawing in his belly. It was November 1098, and the army of God was rotting in Antioch. 6 months had passed since the miraculous victory over Kerboga. 6 months since the discovery of the Holy Lance. 6 months since the gates had been thrown open and the city taken. But the triumph had curdled into something bitter and stagnant. The princes, those great lords who had sworn oaths to march to Jerusalem, now squabbled like merchants over a market stall, and the army they commanded was slowly starving to death. The good knight stood in the courtyard of a half-ruined palace, his silver armor dulled by months of dust and neglect. Around him, other knights sat in small clusters, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. The horses, those magnificent destriers that had carried them across Anatolia and into the heart of the Levant, were gone. Eaten, first out of necessity, then out of desperation. A knight without a horse was no knight at all, merely a man in expensive metal, and the good knight felt the weight of that demotion in his bones. He had not come to the east for this. He had taken the cross in the autumn of 1096, in the cathedral of his lord's domain, kneeling before the bishop as the red cloth was sewn onto his cloak. He had wept then, overcome by the promise of salvation, the vision of Jerusalem restored to Christendom, the Holy Sepulchre freed from the hands of the infidel. He had imagined glory, clean, righteous, divinely ordained. He had imagined himself riding through the gates of the holy city, his armor shining, his soul cleansed. He had not imagined this, the endless waiting, the political paralysis, the slow erosion of faith and flesh. The cause of the stagnation was simple, and it was poisonous. Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman prince who had masterminded the capture of Antioch, refused to relinquish the city. He claimed it as his own principality, in direct violation of the oaths he had sworn to the Byzantine Emperor Alexios. Raymond of Toulouse, Count Raymond of Saint-Gilles, the wealthiest and most pious of the Crusader lords, refused to march south unless Bohemond honored those oaths or committed to the journey to Jerusalem. And so the army sat and starved. The good knight had heard the arguments 100 times, relayed through the camp by squires and chaplains. Bohemond's position was pragmatic. Antioch was a prize worth keeping, a foothold in the east, a city that could anchor a new Christian kingdom. Raymond's position was spiritual. The crusade was not about carving out fiefdoms, it was about liberating the tomb of Christ. Both men were right. Both men were wrong. And while they debated, the soldiers ate their belts. The death of Adhemar of Le Puy in August had removed the only man capable of mediating the dispute. The papal legate, a bishop of wisdom and authority, had been the moral center of the expedition. Without him, the princes were rudderless, each pursuing his own ambition under the banner of God's will. The good knight had stopped believing in the visions. Peter Bartholomew, the peasant visionary who claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance beneath the floor of Antioch's cathedral, still wandered the camp, preaching and prophesying. But his words rang hollow now. The lance had brought victory at the Orontes, yes, but what good was a relic if the army it inspired was too weak to march? The good knight had seen men collapse from hunger during morning prayers. He had seen priests too faint to lift the chalice. The miracles had stopped. In July, a knight named Raymond Pilot, a vassal of Count Raymond, had led an expedition south, hoping to secure food and perhaps open the road to Jerusalem. The target had been a city called Maarat al-Numan, a prosperous trading town on the limestone plateau between Antioch and Damascus. The good knight had not been part of that expedition, but he had heard the stories when the survivors limped back into camp. It had been a disaster. Pilate's forces, overconfident and understrength, had been routed by the garrison at Maarat. The Crusaders had suffered heavy casualties and retreated in disarray. The defeat had two consequences. It proved that the road to Jerusalem was defended, and it left the army trapped in the barren hinterland of Antioch as winter approached. By November, the pressure from below, from the common soldiers, the infantry, the pilgrims, had become unbearable. They called themselves the pauperes, the poor, and they were the majority of the army. They had no horses to eat, no wealth to buy bread from the few merchants who still dared approach the camp. They were dying in the hundreds, their bodies piled in the streets of Antioch's lower quarters, and they blamed the princes. The good knight had heard their songs, bitter and mocking, sung around campfires. The lords eat figs while we eat dirt. The lords wear silk while we wear hurt. The petzat lords delay while we decay, and Christ's own tomb grows farther away. It was sedition, but no one stopped it. The princes knew the army was on the edge of mutiny, and so, finally, Raymond of Toulouse agreed to march. The target, once again, was Maarat al-Numan. This time, the full weight of the Crusader host would descend upon it. This time, there would be no retreat. The good knight tightened the straps of his armor and checked his sword. The blade was still sharp, though the hilt was worn smooth by months of use. He had no horse, so he would march on foot with the other dismounted knights, a humiliation he bore in silence. Around him, the camp stirred to life. Tents were struck, banners raised, prayers muttered. The army was moving at last. But as the good knight fell into the column, his stomach empty and his legs weak, he felt no joy, only a cold, creeping dread. He did not know what awaited him at Maarat, but he would remember it for the rest of his life. The road from Antioch to Maarat al-Numan was not long, perhaps 50 miles, but to the good knight it felt like a pilgrimage through purgatory. The army moved slowly, a great serpent of men and carts winding through the hills of northern Syria. The landscape was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, limestone ridges dotted with olive groves, valleys filled with the skeletal remains of vineyards, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. But the beauty was lost on the soldiers. They were too hungry to notice. The good knight marched in the vanguard, among the dismounted knights of Raymond's contingent. His silver armor, once a source of pride, now felt like a burden. Each step sent a jolt of pain through his knees and hips. His body, deprived of adequate food for months, was consuming itself. He could feel the muscle wasting away, the strength draining from his limbs. He had become a ghost in metal. Around him, other knights trudged in silence. There was little conversation. What was there to say? They were all thinking the same thing. Will there be food at Maarat? Will the city have grain stores? Will we finally eat? The common soldiers, the infantry and pilgrims, were in worse condition. The good knight saw men stumbling, collapsing, being dragged to the side of the road by their companions. Some were left behind, too weak to continue, their fate left to God or the vultures. The camp followers, the women and children who had accompanied the army from Europe, were skeletal. The good knight saw a woman carrying a child, both of them so thin they looked like figures carved from wax. The child's eyes were enormous, staring at nothing. The Taffers marched at the rear. The good knight had heard of them, but he had never seen them up close until now. They were the poorest of the poor, men who had taken vows of absolute poverty and fought with clubs, knives, and their bare hands. They wore rags, their hair matted, their skin covered in sores. They sang as they marched, wild, discordant hymns that sounded more like curses than prayers. The other soldiers avoided them. There was something feral about the Taffurs, something that unsettled even the hardened veterans. The good knight had heard rumors that the Taffurs ate anything: dogs, rats, leather, even the unburied dead. He had dismissed the rumors as exaggeration. Now, watching them lope along the road, their eyes bright with a strange, manic energy, he was not so sure. On the third day of the march, the army reached the outskirts of Maarat al-Numan. The city sat on a low rise, surrounded by fields and orchards. From a distance it looked prosperous: stone walls, a central citadel, the minarets of mosques rising above the rooftops. The good knight felt a flicker of hope. A city that size would have granaries, storehouses, perhaps even livestock. If they could take it quickly, the famine would end. But first they had to break the walls. The army encamped in the fields around the city, spreading out in a loose perimeter. The good knight was assigned to a section of the line facing the eastern gate. He and his fellow knights dug shallow trenches, erected crude palisades, and waited for orders. The waiting was the worst part. The good knight sat on the cold ground, his back against a stone, and watched the city. He could see figures moving on the walls, defenders preparing for the siege. He wondered what they were thinking. Did they know what was coming? Did they know that the army outside their gates was not a disciplined military force, but a starving mob held together by desperation and the thinnest veneer of faith? That night, the good knight did not sleep. He lay on the ground, staring up at the stars, and thought about home. He thought about the fields of his lord's estate, the smell of bread baking in the manor's kitchen, the taste of roasted meat and honeyed wine. He thought about the life he had left behind, the life he would never return to. He thought about the oaths he had sworn to protect the weak, to uphold justice, to serve God and King. He had broken the first two. He wondered how long it would be before he broke the third. The siege of Maarat al-Numan began in earnest on the morning of November 28th, 1098. The good knight stood in the cold dawn light, watching as the engineers surveyed the walls. The city's defenses were formidable, not as imposing as Antioch's, but strong enough to repel a direct assault. The walls were stone, perhaps 20 feet high, with towers at regular intervals. A dry moat encircled the perimeter. The gates were reinforced with iron. The Crusader commanders, Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond of Taranto, who had joined the expedition at the last moment, held a council in the center of the camp. The GoodKnight was not privy to the discussions, but the outcome was clear. They would need siege engines. The problem was timber. The region around Maarat was largely treeless. The limestone plateau offered little in the way of wood suitable for construction. The engineers would have to scavenge, dismantling houses in nearby villages, foraging in distant valleys, stripping beams from abandoned structures. The GoodKnight was assigned to a work detail. For the next 2 weeks, he labored alongside common soldiers and pilgrims, tearing apart buildings and hauling timber back to the camp. It was brutal, degrading work. His hands, once smooth and calloused only from the grip of a sword, became raw and blistered. His back ached, his stomach, empty save for the occasional scrap of mouldy bread, cramped and twisted. But the work continued. Slowly, the siege tower began to take shape. It was a massive structure, built under the direction of Raymond's engineers. The tower was designed to be rolled up to the city walls, allowing knights and infantry to storm the ramparts from above. It was constructed in sections. A wooden frame covered with raw hides to protect against fire, a platform at the top for archers and crossbowmen, a drawbridge that could be lowered onto the wall. The GoodKnight watched the tower rise, beam by beam, and felt a grim satisfaction. This was something tangible, something real. The tower was a promise. We will break you. While the tower was being built, the Norman sappers, Bohemond's men, began digging at the base of the walls. Their goal was to undermine a section of the curtain, weakening the foundation until the stones collapsed. It was dangerous work. The defenders on the walls rained down stones, arrows, and pots of boiling oil. Several sappers were killed, their bodies dragged back to camp and buried in shallow graves. The GoodKnight did not envy them. By early December, the siege tower was complete. It stood like a wooden cathedral looming over the camp, a monument to desperation and engineering. The GoodKnight was chosen to be part of the assault team, a dubious honor. He would climb the tower with a dozen other knights, cross the drawbridge onto the wall, and fight to secure a foothold. He spent the night before the assault, sharpening his sword and praying. The prayer was rote, mechanical. He no longer felt the presence of God. But he prayed anyway, because it was what a knight did. Because it was all he had left. December 11th, 1098. The assault began at dawn. The GoodKnight stood inside the siege tower, packed shoulder to shoulder with other knights. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and fear. Below, teams of soldiers pushed the tower forward, rolling it on wooden wheels across the uneven ground. The tower creaked and groaned, swaying with each lurch. The GoodKnight gripped the wooden railing and tried to steady his breathing. Outside, the defenders of Maarat were screaming. The GoodKnight could hear them through the hide-covered walls of the tower, shouts in Arabic, the twang of bowstrings, the crash of stones against the structure. The tower shuddered under the impacts, but it held. The engineers had done their work well. Slowly, agonizingly, the tower approached the wall. The GoodKnight climbed the ladder to the top platform. Around him, crossbowmen were already firing through the narrow slits, trying to suppress the defenders on the ramparts. The noise was deafening, the thud of bolts hitting stone, the screams of the wounded, the roar of the Crusader army below. And then, with a final lurch, the tower stopped. They were at the wall. The drawbridge was lowered with a crash, slamming down onto the parapet. The GoodKnight did not think. He charged. He crossed the drawbridge in 3 strides, his sword raised, his vision narrowed to a tunnel. A defender appeared in front of him. a young man in a leather cuirass, wielding a spear. The good knight batted the spear aside and drove his sword into the man's chest. The blade punched through the leather and into flesh. The man gasped, blood bubbling from his lips, and fell. The good knight stepped over the body and kept moving. The rampart was chaos. Crusaders poured across the drawbridge, clashing with the defenders in a brutal melee. The good knight fought on instinct, his body moving without thought. He parried a sword strike, countered with a thrust, felt the blade bite into something soft. He did not look at the faces. He could not afford to. The defenders fought desperately, but they were outnumbered. The Crusaders pushed forward, driving them back from the wall. Below, in the city, the good knight could see civilians fleeing, running toward the citadel. He could hear the screams of women and children. By midday, the Crusaders had secured a section of the wall. But the city had not fallen. The defenders retreated into the fortified houses, and the citadel barricading themselves in. The sun was setting, and the Crusader commanders called a halt. The army would bivouac among the outer defenses and resume the assault in the morning. The good knight descended from the wall and found a place to sit among the rubble. His armor was dented, his sword notched. His hands were shaking. He looked down and saw that they were covered in blood, some his own, most not. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the city, the wailing of the wounded, the crackle of fires, the distant prayers of the defenders. He thought about the young man he had killed on the wall, the way his eyes had widened in surprise, the way the blood had bubbled from his lips. The good knight closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. December 12, 1098. The city fell at dawn. The good knight was roused by the sound of horns, the signal to advance. He pulled himself to his feet, his body stiff and aching, and joined the column of knights moving toward the breach. The sappers had done their work during the night. A section of the wall had collapsed, leaving a gap wide enough for men to pour through. But before the assault could begin, a delegation emerged from the city. The good knight watched from a distance as the Muslim leaders approached Bohemon's banner. They were older men, dressed in fine robes, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. They carried no weapons. They had come to negotiate. The good knight could not hear the conversation, but he saw Bohemond nod, saw the delegation bow, saw them return to the city. Word spread quickly through the ranks. The garrison had surrendered. Bohemond had promised them safe conduct. They would gather in a designated palace under his protection, and in exchange, the city would be spared a sack. The good knight felt a flicker of relief. Perhaps this would end without further bloodshed. Perhaps the famine would end, and the army could march on to Jerusalem with some measure of honor intact. He was wrong. The moment the gates opened, the Crusader army surged forward. The good knight was swept along in the tide, carried through the breach and into the streets of Maarat. Around him, soldiers, knights, infantry, pilgrims poured into the city like a flood. The discipline that had held during the siege evaporated in an instant. The army became a mob. The good knight saw a group of infantry drag a man from his house and cut his throat in the street. He saw a woman clutching a child, both of them screaming, as a knight tore them apart. He saw the Tarfers, their faces twisted with glee, smashing down doors and pulling people into the open. The massacre had begun. The good knight tried to stop it. He grabbed a soldier by the arm, shouted at him to stand down, but the man shook him off and kept moving. The good knight realized, with a sickening clarity, that there was no stopping this. The army was beyond control. He moved through the streets in a daze, his sword still sheathed. Around him, the city was being torn apart. Houses were looted, their contents dragged into the streets. Men were killed where they stood. Women and children were seized, bound, and herded into groups, slaves, to be sold in the markets of Antioch. And then the good knight saw the palace. It was the building where Bohemond had promised the garrison safe conduct. The Norman banner still flew above the entrance, but the doors had been broken open, and Crusader soldiers were dragging men out in chains. The good knight understood. Bohemond had lied. The garrison leaders, the men who had trusted the Normans' word, were being executed or enslaved. The promise of safe conduct had been a ruse, a way to disarm the defenders and make the sack easier. The good knight felt something break inside him. He had believed once that the crusade was a holy endeavor. He had believed that the knights of Christendom were bound by oaths, by honor, by the laws of God and man. But here, in the blood-soaked streets of Maarat, he saw the truth. The oaths meant nothing. Honor was a luxury the starving could not afford. He turned away from the palace and walked deeper into the city. The killing continued for hours. By nightfall, the streets were choked with bodies. The good knight found a corner of a ruined house and sat down, his back against the wall. He could hear the screams, the laughter, the crackling of fires. He closed his eyes and tried to block it out, but he could not. The massacre of Maarat was not a battle. It was a slaughter. And the good knight, by his presence, by his silence, was complicit. He would carry that guilt for the rest of his life. The city was taken, but the hunger remained. The good knight had hoped, foolishly, desperately, that the fall of Maarat would mean food. He had imagined granaries bursting with wheat, storehouses filled with oil and dried fruit, livestock penned in courtyards. But the city had been under siege for weeks. Its own supplies were depleted. What little food remained was consumed in the first hours of the sack, devoured by the ravenous vanguard before the rest of the army could even enter the gates. By the evening of December 12th, the good knight's stomach was as empty as it had been that morning, and the army settled into the ruins to wait. The good knight did not understand at first why they were waiting. The city was taken. The road to Jerusalem lay open. But the princes, Raymond and Bohemond, were arguing again. This time, the dispute was over Maarat itself. Bohemond wanted to claim the city, to add it to his growing principality. Raymond refused to allow it, insisting that the army must march on to Jerusalem without delay. And so the soldiers sat in the rubble, and the days stretched into weeks, and the famine deepened. The good knight found shelter in a half-collapsed house near the eastern wall. The roof was gone, but the walls provided some protection from the wind. He shared the space with 3 other knights, men he barely knew. They did not speak much. There was nothing to say. The days blurred together. The good knight woke each morning to the same gnawing emptiness in his belly. He spent the days searching for food. Anything. Everything. He scavenged through the ruins, turning over stones, digging through refuse piles, hoping to find a scrap of bread, a forgotten sack of grain, a root vegetable overlooked by the looters. He found nothing. The city had been picked clean. The horses were gone, eaten in the first week. The good knight had watched as the last of the destriers were slaughtered, their meat divided among the knights. He had received a portion, a small, stringy piece of flank, and he had eaten it raw, too hungry to wait for a fire. The meat had been tough and gamey, but it had filled his stomach for a few hours. When the horses were gone, the army turned to the dogs. The good knight saw men hunting the feral dogs that roamed the ruins, chasing them through the streets with clubs and knives. The dogs were fast and clever, but hunger made the men faster. The good knight did not participate in the hunts. He could not bring himself to do it. But he ate the meat when it was offered, because the alternative was starvation. When the dogs were gone, the army turned to the rats. The good knight saw soldiers setting traps, baiting them with scraps of leather. The rats were small and bony, but they were food. The good knight ate rat meat twice. It tasted like ash and rot, but he forced it down. When the rats were gone, the army turned to the leather. The good knight watched as men boiled their belts, their boots, their saddle straps, trying to extract some nutritional value from the hide. The resulting broth was thin and foul, but it was something. The good knight drank it, gagging on the taste, and felt no better. And still, the princes argued. The good knight heard the rumors that spread through the camp. Raymond had offered to pay Bohemond to leave Maarat. Bohemond had refused. The soldiers were threatening to mutiny. The Taffers were singing songs about eating the princes. The good knight no longer cared. He was too weak to care. By late December, the good knight could barely stand. His body, deprived of food for months, was consuming itself. He could feel his muscles wasting away, his bones pressing against his skin. His mind was foggy, his thoughts slow and disjointed. He spent most of his time lying on the ground, staring at the sky, waiting for something, death or deliverance, he did not know which. And then the winter came. The good knight had not expected the cold. Syria was supposed to be warm, a land of sun and sand. But the winter of 1098 was brutal. The temperatures dropped near freezing. Rain fell in sheets, turning the camp into a quagmire of mud and filth. The good knight had no shelter, no fire, no dry clothes. He shivered through the nights, his teeth chattering, his body racked with chills. The cold made the hunger worse. The good knight's body, desperate for warmth, burned through what little energy it had left. He felt himself slipping away, fading into a kind of waking death. He stopped moving. He stopped thinking. He simply existed, a hollow shell in silver armor, waiting for the end. And then, one morning, he smelled something cooking. The good knight lifted his head, his nostrils flaring. The smell was faint, but unmistakable. Roasting meat. His stomach clenched, and he felt a surge of desperate animal hunger. He pulled himself to his feet and stumbled toward the source of the smell. He found a group of Taffers gathered around a fire. They were roasting something on a spit, a large piece of meat, charred and dripping fat. The good knight's mouth watered. He approached the fire, his legs shaking, and one of the Taffers looked up at him. The man's face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but there was a strange, manic light in them. "Hungry, knight?" the Taffer asked. The good knight nodded. The Taffer grinned, showing blackened teeth. He cut a piece of meat from the spit and handed it to the good knight. The good knight took it. The meat was hot, almost burning his fingers. He brought it to his mouth and bit down. It was tough, stringy, with a strange, sweet flavor. But it was food. The good knight chewed and swallowed, and felt the warmth spread through his body. He took another bite, and another, devouring the meat with desperate, mindless hunger. And then he saw the pile of bones beside the fire. They were not animal bones. They were human. The good knight stopped chewing. He looked down at the meat in his hand, and then at the Taffers, and then at the bones. His mind, slow and foggy, struggled to process what he was seeing. The Taffer who had given him the meat was still grinning. "Saracen," the man said, as if that explained everything. "Plenty of them lying around. No sense letting them go to waste." The good knight dropped the meat. He staggered away from the fire, his stomach heaving. He fell to his knees and vomited, retching until there was nothing left. But the taste remained in his mouth, sweet and foul, and he knew he would never be rid of it. He had eaten human flesh. The good knight knelt in the mud, his body shaking, and wept. The cannibalism at Maarat was not an isolated incident. It was everywhere. The good knight saw it in the days that followed, though he tried not to look. He saw the Taffers dragging bodies from the ruins, butchering them in the open. He saw soldiers, knights, infantry, pilgrims, gathered around fires, roasting meat that was not animal. He saw the piles of bones, stripped clean, discarded in the streets. And he heard the stories. The stories spread through the camp like a plague, whispered in the darkness, spoken in hushed, horrified tones. The good knight heard that the Tarfurs were boiling adults in stew pots, roasting children on spits. He heard that some men preferred the flesh of the young, claiming it was more tender. He heard that the bodies were being exhumed from shallow graves, that the putrid corpses of the Saracens were being consumed alongside the freshly dead. He did not know what to believe, but he knew it was true. The good knight tried to avoid the fires, tried to stay away from the groups of soldiers who had descended into the abomination. But the camp was small, and the smell was everywhere. The sickly sweet stench of roasting human flesh, mingling with the smoke and the mud and the rot. He could not escape it. One night, the good knight sat alone in his ruined house, staring at the wall. He was too weak to move, too weak to think. His mind drifted, untethered, and he found himself remembering the cathedral where he had taken the cross. He remembered the bishop's voice, solemn and resonant, speaking of the glory of God and the salvation of Jerusalem. He remembered the red cloth sewn onto his cloak, the symbol of his vow, to serve God, to protect the weak, to uphold justice. The good knight laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. He had failed. He had stood by while the garrison of Maarat was betrayed and slaughtered. He had watched as the city was sacked, as women and children were enslaved. And now he had eaten the flesh of the dead. He was damned. The good knight closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. He had lost his faith somewhere in the mud and blood of Maarat. He no longer believed in the visions, the relics, the promises of salvation. He no longer believed in God, or perhaps God no longer believed in him. The next morning, the good knight forced himself to stand. He could not stay in the house any longer. He had to move, had to do something, or he would go mad. He walked through the camp, his legs unsteady, his vision blurred. Around him, the army was a shadow of itself. The soldiers were skeletal, their faces hollow, their eyes empty. They moved like ghosts, shuffling through the ruins, searching for food that did not exist. The good knight saw a group of knights gathered near the citadel. He recognized some of them, men he had fought beside at Antioch, men he had shared bread with in better times. They were arguing, their voices raised, their gestures sharp. The good knight approached and listened. They were talking about the princes. "Raymond and Bohemond are killing us," one knight said, his voice hoarse. "They sit in their palaces, arguing over stones, while we starve in the streets. We should march without them." Another said, "We should leave this cursed place and go to Jerusalem, with or without the princes." "And how do we march?" A third knight asked. "We have no food, no horses, no strength. We'll die on the road." "We're dying here," the first knight said. "At least on the road, we'll be moving toward something." The good knight said nothing. He turned and walked away. But the conversation stayed with him. The soldiers were right. The princes were killing them. The paralysis, the political maneuvering, the refusal to march, it was all a death sentence. The army could not stay in Maarat, but it could not leave either. They were trapped, caught between the ambitions of their leaders and the biological imperative to survive. And so they ate the dead. The good knight understood now why it had happened. It was not madness, not evil. It was necessity. The human body, pushed to the edge of starvation, will do anything to survive. The taboos, the moral boundaries, the laws of God and man, they all dissolve in the face of hunger. But understanding did not make it easier. The good knight returned to his house and sat down. He looked at his hands, still stained with blood from the assault on the walls. He thought about the meat he had eaten, the taste that still lingered in his mouth. He thought about the young man he had killed on the ramparts, the way his eyes had widened in surprise. He thought about the oaths he had sworn, the life he had left behind, the man he had been, and he wept. Chapter 8. The Letter to the Pope. The good knight did not know, in those dark days of December, that the leaders of the crusade were writing a letter. It would not be sent until months later, after the fall of Jerusalem, but the seeds of it were planted in the ruins of Maarat. The princes, Raymond, Bohemond, Godfrey, and the others, knew that what had happened in the city could not be hidden. The cannibalism was too widespread, too well documented. The Muslim world would remember it, the Byzantine court would hear of it, and eventually the Pope would hear of it. And so they decided to confess. The letter addressed to Pope Paschal II was a masterpiece of theological maneuvering. It acknowledged the cannibalism, but framed it as an act of necessity, a test from God, a trial that the faithful had endured and survived. The key phrase, carefully crafted, read, "There was so great a famine in the army that the putrid bodies of the Saracens were eaten up by the Christian people." The good knight would not read the letter until years later, but when he did, he would recognize the strategy. The princes were invoking the principle of necessitas, the idea that extreme circumstances could mitigate sin. They emphasized that the bodies were putrid, implying that they were already dead, that the soldiers had not murdered for food. They framed the act as a collective failure, a consequence of the famine, rather than a moral defect of the individuals involved. It was a lie, of course, or at least a half-truth. The good knight knew that some of the bodies had not been putrid. He had seen the Tafers dragging freshly killed corpses to the fires. He had heard the stories of men being murdered for their flesh. But the letter did not mention that. The letter was designed to absolve the leadership, to shift the blame onto the faceless mass of the Christian people, and to ensure that the crusade could continue with the Pope's blessing. And it worked. The Pope, upon receiving the letter, did not excommunicate the Crusaders. He did not condemn them. He accepted their confession, offered absolution, and praised them for their perseverance in the face of hardship. The good knight, when he learned of this, felt nothing. He had long since stopped expecting justice. Chapter 9. The Revolt. By early January, the army was on the edge of collapse. The good knight could feel it in the air, a tension that crackled like lightning before a storm. The soldiers were no longer willing to wait. They had endured the famine, the cold, the horror of the cannibalism, and they had reached their breaking point. The princes were still arguing. Raymond and Bohemond, locked in their petty rivalry, refused to compromise. Raymond wanted to march to Jerusalem. Bohemond wanted to keep Maarat. Neither would yield. And so the soldiers decided to act. The good knight first heard of the revolt on the morning of January 4th, 1099. He was sitting in his ruined house, too weak to move, when a knight burst in and told him to come to the citadel. Something was happening. The good knight pulled himself to his feet and followed. The citadel square was packed with soldiers, knights, infantry, pilgrims, Tafers. They were shouting, their voices a chaotic roar. The good knight pushed his way through the crowd and saw Raymond of Toulouse standing on a platform, his face pale, his hands raised for silence. The soldiers were demanding that the army march to Jerusalem. They were demanding that the princes stop arguing and fulfill their vows. They were demanding that the walls of Maarat be torn down. The good knight did not understand the last demand at first, but then he heard the explanation, shouted by a knight near the front. "As long as the walls stand, the princes will fight over them." Tear down the walls and there will be nothing left to fight over." It was brilliant, in a desperate, destructive way. The soldiers realized that the city itself was the problem. As long as Maarat was a fortress, it was a prize worth keeping. But if the walls were destroyed, if the city was reduced to rubble, then it would be worthless. Bohemond would have no reason to stay. Raymond would have no reason to delay. The army could march. Raymond, standing on the platform, looked out at Antioch, the sea of faces. The good knight saw the calculation in his eyes. The count knew he had lost control. If he did not agree to the soldiers' demands, they would march without him. Or worse, they would turn on him. Raymond nodded. "Tear down the walls," he said. The crowd erupted in cheers. The good knight joined the work detail that afternoon. It was brutal, exhausting labor. The soldiers, already weakened by months of starvation, attacked the walls with hammers, pry bars, and their bare hands. The good knight swung a sledgehammer at the stone, each blow sending a jolt of pain through his arms and shoulders. The wall was thick, built to withstand siege engines, but the soldiers were relentless. They worked through the day and into the night, by the light of torches. The good knight's hands bled, his muscles screamed, but he did not stop. None of them stopped. By the morning of January 13th, the walls of Maarat al-Numan were rubble. The city, which had stood for centuries, was now an open ruin. The good knight stood among the debris, his body trembling with exhaustion, and looked at what they had done. They had destroyed their own conquest, but they were free. Chapter 10. The Barefoot March. On January 13th, 1099, the army of God left Maarat al-Numan. The good knight stood in the column, his silver armor hanging loosely on his emaciated frame, and watched as Raymond of Toulouse led the procession out of the city. The count was walking barefoot, dressed in the simple robes of a pilgrim, his head bowed in penance. It was a performance, the good knight knew. Raymond was trying to reclaim his spiritual authority, to remind the soldiers that the crusade was a pilgrimage, not a conquest. But the good knight did not care. He was too tired to care. The army marched south, toward the coast, toward Jerusalem. The good knight walked in silence, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Around him, the other soldiers were equally silent. There was no singing, no prayers, no talk of glory. They were a broken army, held together by nothing more than the momentum of the march. The good knight thought about Maarat. He thought about the massacre, the famine, the cannibalism. He thought about the young man he had killed on the walls, the meat he had eaten by the fire, the oaths he had broken. He thought about the man he had been, and the man he had become. He was still alive. He had survived. But he was not the same. The good knight looked down at his hands, scarred and blood-stained, and wondered if he would ever be clean again. He did not think so. But he kept walking, because that was all he could do. Chapter 11. The Shadow of Maarat. The army marched for weeks, winding through the hills of Lebanon, skirting the coast, moving ever closer to Jerusalem. The good knight walked in a daze, his body moving on instinct, his mind numb. The famine eased, slowly. The coastal towns, terrified by the stories of Maarat, surrendered without a fight and provided tribute. Grain, oil, livestock. The good knight ate bread for the first time in months, and it tasted like ash. He could not enjoy it. He could not enjoy anything. The memory of Maarat haunted him. He saw it in his dreams. The fires, the bodies, the Tarfers grinning around their stew pots. He woke in the night, gasping, his body drenched in sweat. He could still taste the meat, sweet and foul, and he would retch until his stomach was empty. The other soldiers did not speak of Maarat. It was as if they had made a collective decision to forget, to bury the memory beneath the march and the mission. But the good knight could not forget. He carried it with him, a weight heavier than his armor. In April, the army reached the outskirts of Jerusalem. The good knight stood on a hill and looked down at the city, the golden dome of the rock gleaming in the sun, the walls of the Holy Sepulchre rising above the rooftops. He had made it. He had survived the journey, the battles, the famine, the horror. He had reached the goal of the crusade, but he felt nothing. The good knight knelt on the hill and tried to pray. He tried to summon the faith that had carried him across Europe, the belief that had sustained him through the darkest days, but the words would not come. He was empty. The siege of Jerusalem began in June. The good knight fought on the walls, his sword rising and falling, his body moving through the motions of war. He did not think. He did not feel. He simply fought. On July 15th, 1099, the city fell. The good knight entered Jerusalem with the rest of the army, and he saw the massacre begin again. The streets ran with blood. The soldiers, drunk on victory and vengeance, killed everyone they could find, Muslims, Jews, Christians who looked too foreign. The good knight walked through the carnage, his face blank, his heart cold. He had seen it all before. That evening, the good knight made his way to the church of the Holy Sepulchre. The other knights were there, kneeling before the tomb of Christ, weeping with joy. The good knight knelt beside them and bowed his head, and he wept. But his tears were not tears of joy. They were tears of grief, of guilt, of a soul that had been broken and could not be repaired. The good knight had reached Jerusalem. He had fulfilled his vow, but he had lost himself along the way. Epilogue: The Scar. The good knight remained in the Holy Land for 2 more years, fighting in the wars that followed the conquest. He served under Godfrey of Bouillon, then under Baldwin, the first king of Jerusalem. He fought the Fatimids at Ascalon, the Turks in the north, the bandits in the hills. He survived, but he was never the same. The other knights spoke of glory, of the triumph of Christendom, of the miracle of the crusade. The good knight said nothing. He had seen the truth beneath the glory, the rot beneath the miracle. He had seen Maarat. In 1101, the good knight left Jerusalem. He did not return to Europe. He could not face the life he had left behind, the man he had been. Instead, he wandered, a knight without a lord, a pilgrim without a destination. He walked through the deserts of Syria, the mountains of Anatolia, the plains of Mesopotamia. He fought in small wars, served petty lords, and moved on when the memories became too heavy. He never spoke of Maarat. But he carried it with him, always. The taste of the meat, the smell of the fires, the sound of the Tarfas singing. The good knight had survived the siege of Maarat al-Numan, but a part of him had died there, in the ruins of that cursed city, and he would never get it back.